all my things I believed in had built 50 years of my life on. It was literally vaporized.
Today we are joined by Nadim Ednan-Laperouse OBE, founder of the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, which was established in the name of Nadim and Tanya's daughter, Natasha. You knew from very early on that she had allergies.
Your eyes were always flitting from left to right to look for traces of food, getting on, inventing our own versions of what to do and how to do to look after Natasha or keep her safe around food.
Would you mind taking us through the events of that day?
We were going on a short trip to the south of France. We popped into Pret-a-Manger and we examined Natasha's choice. We all ate the food within a matter of minutes, and then we got straight on the plane. About 40 minutes in, she said to me, "I think I'm having an allergic reaction." And she lifted up her top. Her skin was flaming red. And she said, Daddy, I can't breathe. Help me." We laid Natasha down. She's completely unconscious. The doctor and I were doing CPR. The pilot, he was just weeping. Everybody just had their head down. And I looked at the heart monitor and it had flatlined. I realized, oh my God, she's gone. She's actually gone.
I don't want to not mention some of the work that you've done since.
Natasha's law was born out of trying to fix, essentially, a hole in the law of this country to stop people dying again in that way. We've come to know around 50 families whose children have died in the UK since our own daughter died from food allergies. And we travel the country to meet them and to sit with them and cry with them and hear their stories.
I have seen elsewhere you speak of the fact, though, that in that moment with the paramedics on hand, you sort of had a vision almost. Tell us about what happened. Hello and welcome back to the Re-Enchanting podcast from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Briley.
I'm Belle Tyndall.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably disenchanted material world with the Christian vision of reality. And today we've got a really interesting and special guest for you.
We do. Today we are joined by Nadim Ednan-Laperouse OBE, who is the founder and trustee, along with his wife Tanya, of the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, which was established in the name of Nadim and Tanya's daughter, Natasha, who died as a result of an allergic reaction to a baguette which did not have the correct information on its packaging. The story of Natasha's death captured the attention of the nation and is still inspiring invaluable research and change. And so Nadim is so generously going to talk to us about Natasha, about grief, about hope, and about the change he is determined to make.
Nadim, thank you so much for being with us.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I understand that every time you talk about this issue, relive those events, I'm sure it brings up all kinds of feelings. But we're really grateful for you taking the time to talk to us today. Before we dive in, we are once again in the beautiful surroundings of Lambeth Palace Library, looking out across the London skyline. Not your first time in this room, I've heard as well. So you've appreciated this before.
Yes, I've been here a couple of times, certainly with through the Lambeth Partnership. I think we ended up having dinner with Archbishop Welby and then a breakfast with him on another another event. And he was fully au fait of our story, actually, which was a good thing because we were able to speak to him quite openly about it and faith in a way that was quite natural and free-flowing, which is surprising perhaps for many people on the outside.
Well, because we are at the top of Lambeth Palace Library, our signature question for every guest is, what are you currently reading?
Yes, so I've just finished this book here, and it's a book which is really a story of how someone came to faith. So it's a true story. It's autobiographical, and it's my wife Tanya. She was reading it, and afterwards she said, "Oh, you really should read this. This kind of book is really for you." And it's called "What I Saw in Heaven." What I Saw in Heaven by Heidi Barr, and it's a story actually of a young woman back quite a few decades ago, back in this 50s, 60s era, really, in Iowa, in central, sort of middle of America, coming to faith, to Jesus, that is. Born in an Orthodox Jewish family that didn't believe in Jesus at all, and in fact called the whole story a big hoax. And that was drummed into her again and again and again. and there was little love in her family life. But the only thing she did love was horse riding. There's one thing she had a connection to, and but she fell off the horse at one point, age 15, and died. It's a story of her dying, the horse landing on top of her, and Jesus coming to her and whisking her away. And the story of how that happened, what happened, and all that she remembers about it in great detail, but then coming back to life physically in this world through resuscitation.
Wow.
And how that whole episode changed the course of what would happen to her next for the better. It's an incredible sort of story, and a real life story. It's a story of how Jesus really turns ashes into something of beauty, really.
Wow. That sounds incredible. And people who bring in their books are my favorite type of guest.
Yes. It's this book.
This one. I love that. We are going to speak about what happened in 2016 and how life has looked since then. But before we do that, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what your life looked like before 2016.
Yeah. So before 2016, how people and myself would characterize myself and my wife, Tanya, was very much someone of no faith whatsoever. That I mean spiritual faith at all. Certainly didn't believe in God and didn't have any need for such thoughts, really. Someone who entirely believed really in my own ability to achieve things, to build, to succeed. That's how I would really put it, simply like that. And my life really for the first 50 years, if you like, of my life was centered around that kind of thinking and that kind of doing. I think it's important to say doing as well. And I was a toy designer originally, born of my father's Muslim, originally from Afghanistan, going back, and my mother's technically Catholic from France. Single child born here. Neither of them in any way religious or practicing, and nor was any aspect of God or anything discussed in my whole upbringing. But where I did invest myself entirely was the world of business, really, which was how to build, you might call an empire. And that sounds really over the top, but I think this might mean something to people listening, and do it in your own strength. And for me, that was essentially building quite a strong toy company, designing, manufacturing and supplying to about 40-something countries around the world, and believing that and the money that produced was success. So I was very invested in success. What does success look like? Success for me made me feel worthwhile, and I think validated myself, perhaps, really. And not necessarily just to my wife, but I mean to my peer groups and friends around, all around, who would then reinforce that, whether it was on stage with David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, talking about business, et cetera, et cetera. All these sorts of events and things go and reinforce essentially the idea that you have of yourself. And I was absolutely that way. And I was pretty much a workaholic as well. That's what I'd say about myself.
I mean, family did come along, obviously, during that period. So did any of that sort of shape the way you started to think about business and career and what life was about?
Yeah, I think Natasha was born before we got married, just about a year before or so. And we got married and we had another child. And Tanya, my wife, is a single child, from single mother and a single child. I am a single child as well. And we'd said it would be great if we break that mold and have two children. We were blessed. I say now blessed, but I wouldn't use those sort of words before at all. To have two children, a boy and a girl, perfect, you might say, etc. But even with family life, I must say I was traveling maybe up to 26 countries a year around the world.
Wow.
Very much on planes and trains and whatever you might call it, meeting all sorts of people and conducting the world of business and so forth. And when I was back home, I must say I was exhausted.
Right.
So I really wasn't the best version of myself back home. And as a father, yes, very much loved my children, my wife, but I was not probably the best father that I could have been. There's no doubt about it, because I was always exhausted. And in that, you become irritated quite quickly, to be honest. But I loved my children, and, we used to still have fantastic holidays. That's the important thing. Summer holidays, always doing great things, and, a lot of laughing and enjoyment. So, yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about Natasha? What was she like?
Yeah. So, well, I would characterize her, as very, very loving. Sort of dark hair, dark eyes. You just look into, just wants to make you smile just looking at her.
Yeah.
That warm feeling, very loving, caring. Not at all a difficult child. Wasn't a sort of maybe some people have very rebellious teenagers. We didn't. Thankfully, thankfully, and she was always befriending people at school who were always sort of shunned out on the margins, essentially being bullied. She would always take them by the hand and kind of bring them into the fold, essentially. And she was well recognized for that. And in fact, some of our friends today who obviously still talk about that when they speak to us. And she was brave. I think the word brave, because she did a number of things that I would have never have done at her age. Age 15, I think 3 months before she actually died, she jumped out of an aeroplane at 12,000 feet and skydived.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay. Brave's a good word.
Sort of things that I have a natural sense of not doing that.
Yeah.
She did a number of those sorts of things. Fantastic girl. I wish she was still here.
You knew from very early on that she had allergies.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, because sort of to read about that, to hear you talk about that, I'm so struck by how everything is unknown. All of the danger is unknown when you have a child with quite severe allergies. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to parent a child in those circumstances?
Yes. At the time, we didn't know anyone else who had food allergies or any other children. So we felt entirely isolated as a family, struggling, getting on, inventing our own versions of what to do and how to do to look after Natasha or keep her safe around food. And we discovered she was allergic. We'd never even heard the word allergic. I have no such word comes through my family line or Tanya's, basically, for example. So it's not something you might think like, oh, my dad's diabetic, maybe I will be diabetic. No, not like that at all. And when we were weaning her age 6 months from breast milk, bottled milk into solids, that's when we discovered she had a massive anaphylactic reaction, which we didn't know what that was.
Oh, of course.
Rushed to hospital.
Scary.
Very scary. You've no idea what's going on. It throws you for six. And you're just in, if I would say now in God's hands, but in that time you're in the doctor's hands entirely, just hoping that they know what it is. She survived that. And it put us on a journey of discovering she was allergic to other foods, sesame, nuts, wheat at the time, and of course cow's milk and egg. All this you find out over time after various hospital appointments and so on. But the lack of knowledge, entire lack of knowledge from anyone, really the medical profession and so on, to guide you, as was the case 20 plus years ago, leaves you in a very anxious state all the time. Anxious. Always your eyes flitting from left to right to look for signs of traces of food that might be left somewhere at a party or at an event, or even anywhere really outside of the home, essentially. Puts you in a fraught state of mind. And for Natasha, albeit when she was young, she probably didn't have that sense of it. As she got a bit older and she couldn't go to parties, she couldn't go to her friends' parties, she couldn't go to lots of places, couldn't really eat out ever, because the risks were so overbearing that something would go wrong around ingredients and what she could and couldn't eat safely that could be fatal for her. So life was fraught. And I think more so for people today, they'll understand that who have allergies, because we live in societies where food is around us 24/7. When I was growing up, you had breakfast of some description. You went to school, you got some kind of something to eat at lunchtime, and then maybe a Mars bar or something like that on the way home, and then dinner, and that was it. There were 3 to 4 moments of contact with food. Today, it is a grazing culture where essentially food is everywhere and advertised to everywhere, and people have food all over them from snacking. So it's much more difficult.
And did that mean that you sort of had to learn for yourself what precautions, obviously, to take, but also what medication you needed to have on hand just in case there was an incident?
Absolutely. Medication paramount. It's considered the insurance policy for life, your life insurance. So adrenaline, auto injectors, EpiPens, as
so
sometimes known.
Yeah.
Always 2 on you at everywhere you go at all times.
Now, this is where we come to the really difficult part of this conversation, which is what happened in 2016. Would you mind sort of taking us through the events of that day?
Yeah, I remember it vividly, perhaps unfortunately, but we were going, myself, Natasha, and her best friend Bethany, who was 14 at the time. We were going on just a short trip to the south of France, into Nice, where we used to go for summer, basically, holidays. And Bethany had never been outside of the UK before. And Bethany was Natasha's best friend. She wanted to show her a world that was different than what she knew here. And I was the chauffeur, the guide. I speak fluent French. So, for me, that's quite normal. Getting on a plane, going to the airport, all just stuff I do every week, day in, day out. We got on, basically, we were at Heathrow Airport, of course, early morning. Everybody's hungry because, when you get up early, your tummy rumbles quite quick once you start to move around. So we popped into a pret-a-manger sandwich chain that I knew really well that was in Heathrow Airport. And the girls looked at what they wanted to eat. I did pick something up, and we examined Natasha's choice, closely, the packaging, what it said. She looked at it closely, as she would routinely on any other day. Nothing different, nothing unusual. We all ate the food within a matter of minutes, and then we got straight on the plane. And as the plane took off, I was reading, it was a Sunday, so I was reading the Sunday Times, the business section. So typical of me. I don't think I've done that since, by the way. Reading the papers, the broadsheet outstretched here like that, filling up a lot of the space. Natasha sat next to me here, and Bethany by the window, so she could see a view that she'd not seen before. The girls were listening, sharing their, kind of music through their headphones. And sort of quite a way into the journey, about 40 minutes in of a 2-hour flight, Natasha was sort of looked really uncomfortable. And she said to me, Daddy, look, I think I'm having an allergic reaction. And she lifted up her top so I could see her skin, and it was all red, flaming red, like torch fire, with big welts, etc. And she was scratching and rubbing her throat. And she said, Daddy, I'm having difficulty breathing. Let's go to the toilet, basically now, which was only about 10, 12 feet away at the front of the plane, and give me the EpiPen, in other words, inject the EpiPen. Oh my gosh, okay. So I saw this stewardess pass by. I said, this is what we're about to do. We got up, and within probably 30 seconds, myself and Natasha were cramped into the toilet that barely fits one person in there. And I pulled her leggings down, and I injected her with adrenaline, and I counted to 10 slowly, having memorized the video of how to do it. Never done it before, but I felt very in control, basically. I think that's what I want to say. I didn't think, oh my gosh, this is a nightmare. This is all going to pot. What's happening? I felt this will do it. This is what we've always, believed will work, and the reaction will go into reverse, basically, and we'll be fine. So I was trying to stay calm, ready to talk slowly in a controlled way, etc. Then, thought, okay, looking at her like that, and she's not getting better. She's, Daddy, I still can't breathe. Get the second one. Oh my gosh. I ran quickly to the seat, back in 20 seconds, injected her with a second EpiPen. But it didn't seem to have any effect. Now, I'd never seen the effect it should have. I'd never witnessed it on someone else. People rarely do. These moments come few and far between. But I knew it should get better. But then she said, Dad, she started slumping forward and said, Daddy, I can't breathe. Help me. And those were the last words she spoke to me before she actually passed away a little bit later on in the flight. I was so shocked. She slumped unconscious onto me. I took her out of the toilet like that, put her into the jump seat, which is the little flip down seat as you walk on the plane, where the cabin crew sit for takeoff, and held her back with my hand like that to pin her against the wall, because she would just slump and fall onto the floor like a dead body, like that. And I shouted at the top of my voice for oxygen tank. I felt very in the moment, in control, like a kind of commander of the ship. This is what we're doing, and I told them, I want it now, right now. And we put the mask on. They turned the gas on, the oxygen tank on. I grabbed the tank, I remember, and made sure the flow was maximum flow. Because I remember from just my physics A levels and all that stuff from school, if you have a narrowing tube, your air tubes are narrower. At least if it's pure oxygen going in, I can offset, essentially. It's like a trade-off, essentially. But she just slumped forward, and I realized nothing's getting better. Now I just don't know where this has gone. I've got nothing else, basically. And I couldn't believe really what was going on, but still in the fight, I must say, very in the fight. And I said, shout, call on the overhead speaker thing for a doctor. They did. One came forward minutes later, and there he was, this young man. He looked like my own son. He turned out to be about mid-20s. He told me, I just completed my training yesterday, and I'm off to celebrate with my parents. I said, this is what's happened. We laid Natasha down quickly. She's completely unconscious. She's really swollen to like double her size in her face. The lips have all peeled out, etc. And we started CPR immediately, basically, and really strong compressions, mouth to mouth, etc. But he was feeling her pulse with no equipment. Basically, this is awful. We're mid-flight. Meanwhile, the cabin crew are stepping over and across her body all the time, which seemed ridiculous, to try and serve the food because they were in full flight mode.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
And all of this was like just kind of like didn't make sense. This shouldn't be happening. But I kept talking to her really loudly, egging her to come through. You can do it. So again, I remember this strength thing. I've seen you win the races. Yeah. I've seen you do this at school. Against the odds, you can do it, and constantly drumming that, like repetitive. Meanwhile, the doctor and I were doing CPR, and others were starting to cry. The cabin crew were crying, and even at one point, the pilot came out, and he's so shocked. He was just standing there, and they said that they'd tried to find a way to land, but they were being told to press on,
right? Basically.
And by the time we landed, which was quite some time later, Natasha remained unconscious. It looked terrible. She'd vomited up the food, etc., from all the chest compressions, etc. And her eyes, which had been open, her sockets were full of the food that she'd eaten, which was a red sort of a red tomato-based sandwich filling, and it looked horrendous. The whole situation looked like theatre gone really horrendous theatre, if you know what I mean. And the paramedics came on board straight away, and there was quite a few of them, 3 of them, very big, burly men. In France, paramedics are like firemen. They're different than in the UK. Okay. Quite heavy gear they're wearing. And they started to get to work with, again, more chest compressions. It turned out it was so excessive, the force they used for about half an hour, they broke all her ribs. But we didn't know that till later. And they used a defibrillator. I remember they couldn't get one to work. They had to run off into the airport to get one that worked. I'm kind of bonkers when I think about it. All the time, I was standing there calling to her, come on, come on, come on. I mean, she had all the people around her. There's about 6, 7 people cramped together. 3 paramedics taking in turns like this, compression. And they were dripping with sweat because the heat from the tarmac at that point in the peak of summer was really strong, coming through the door, the open door of the plane. I was holding a saline solution that was a drip that was going into her. They were trying to clear her airways. It's just not working. The heart monitor, which the defibrillator showed there was heart activity. So to me, that kind of, I'm going, that's a good sign. It's a good sign. Yeah. And I remember high-fiving all of the paramedics, all like one, all in French, by the way.
Yeah.
Bang, 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 bang with my right hand to egg them on, knowing like how you have to kind of keep morale going, as it were, of your troops in a way.
So still at this point, you were still like, we can control this.
Absolutely. We can do it. We can do it.
We know what to do.
This is not happening, basically.
Okay.
This is what will be my will happen. And that I was beaming, in effect, I must say, this idea that I could pass my battery power, the energy that's in me, the battery that keeps me alive, into her body. And that would essentially restart all that was needed and reconfigure.
Which I think must be so innate to being a parent. Do you think this idea of, I can keep my child safe, I can keep them alive, I can do this. This is what being a parent is.
Absolutely. I've done it for 15 years. It's not happening now.
This is not the script.
This is not the script. Yeah. Absolutely. Not the script. And I've come from a background then of very much making the script and telling others what to do, and generally from my world of work, and that was quite normal for me at that time.
I have seen elsewhere you speak of the fact, though, that in that moment with the paramedics on hand, you sort of had almost sort of sounds like an almost out of body experience yourself in terms of a vision almost. Tell us about what happened at that point.
Yeah, so there we were in this horrendous situation. I remember the pilot was standing literally about 3 feet in front of me in the doorway, filling the aperture, and he was, full captain gear. He was just weeping, basically. The whole place was like a piece of theatre in the West End where it was so dramatic, essentially. And I remember after high-fiving initially, the paramedics, her heart, the monitors dropped off.
Yeah.
And so they went at it again and again and again, the CPR. Her heart came back just a bit, basically, enough but lower. And suddenly, this is where it all changed. Everybody disappeared in front of me. I'm holding the saline solution here with my hand, like that. I'm holding here, hand against the framework of the aeroplane on the inside, basically the doorway, if you like, internal. And suddenly, Natasha's still there, as she was, exactly as I've seen her all along, but everyone else disappears. And the whole vista, everything I can see, totally is made of yellow light. And no one is there except Natasha and then 5 angels. 5 things I'd never seen in my life, which I would call angels because they were human beings, as in terms of long and skinny, as I described them.
Okay.
From her toes, that side, to her head on that side, pretty much equidistant across the length of her body, hovering with wings, but all had wings on, all made of monochromatic yellow light, just moving like this, like that, above her. But then I was so taken aback, I remember, from this. And I remember it dawning on me, what the heck? Literally, I used those words, what the heck?
Yeah.
Now, bear in mind, I used to swear a lot.
It was a slightly different word.
So it was a stronger, more pronounced word than that. And I remember thinking, this is like in a film when somebody dies. That's just the only recognition I had of that.
Okay.
And I immediately went, it's not her time, shouted that aloud. And with this right hand, whooshed them away like that, basically go in a very polite way of putting it. In that second, as it were, all went, that light disappeared, they went. Everybody comes back into sharp focus who's still where they were, but nobody was moving at all. Everybody just had their head down and we're just frozen, basically. And I looked at the heart monitor and it had flatlined. It'd gone. I realized, oh my God, she's gone. She's actually gone. Then what happened? It seemed to be an acceptance from all those people that there was no more to be done. And essentially it was a case of, if you like, hope, but I wouldn't call it hope at this point. I'd call it just, there's got to be more to do, as it were.
Yeah.
That they took her body off the plane, wrapped her up, put her essentially and took her down a very steep spiral staircase and into a waiting ambulance on the tarmac. And they said, come with us, we'll take you in the other car. So me and Bethany, who'd witnessed most of this, a 14-year-old child, horrendous. We got in the car, the ambulance, and we followed the ambulance. We raced across the city to the other side of Nice, where the main hospital is. And then she was just taken away. And we left for about 2 hours, really waiting, wondering what was going on. So this really powerful vision of yellow, soft yellow light, very bright, but soft. So you don't have to wince to look at it. It's not like, like this. It's very much, I can see everything in the fullest of detail, etc. It came and appeared. It's amazing. I've never seen anything like that before. Never had any idea, vision of anything before until that time.
Was there any part of you in that moment that assumed that was just you, that you were watching something unimaginable and it was some kind of, a psychologist would have language, I don't have it, but some kind of mental way of almost like shielding yourself from seeing what was going on?
Well, it's a good question. And my friends know me and I know myself, very quite logical, quite measured generally.
Yeah.
Certainly I'm talking about myself back then,
Absolutely.
as it were.
Yeah.
And perfectly able to deal with most situations, I would have said, essentially, and had done all around the world in different strange situations, which sometimes were quite life-threatening, whether I was in Russia or in China, and really behind the lines and so forth. But but this, yes, I can see why a lot of people might say exactly what you just said there. But I'd counter that, to be fair, that I've never seen anything like that before. I've never wasn't expecting to see it, and I wasn't so desperate at that time, I would say.
Okay, so it's like you went in a frenzy.
No, not at all. I was really calm and in a controlled way, going through all the things that I mentioned before, talking to Natasha very loudly, etc., and willing her to live, of course. No, and all my friends know me, all my good friends, know me, that I've actually, at that time, very much was very able and capable. And if you want something done, ask Nadim. He has a way of making things happen. That's sort of the kind of person I was, that's all. So no, I can hand on heart say what I saw was absolutely the truth of what I saw. I've no reason really to say otherwise.
Yeah.
And I know myself. I really know myself. I'm very critical of myself, I should say.
So that moment obviously stayed with you, obviously, even as you had to go through the awful reality of accepting that Natasha had died. And how, just kind of maybe walk us through what happened sort of in the aftermath. There was obviously going to be all kinds of emotions and questions that needed resolving. But you were also carrying this extraordinary moment as well that I imagine was quite hard to fit into everything.
Oh, yes. I think what I realized, obviously not in that moment, because it's very hard to be able to understand everything. Literally say, I'm only human is really what I'm just a simple man at the end of the day, really. What the shock that really, I think, that comes after is like an aftershock is how I'd put it. You deal with perhaps the, trying to stand up while there's an earthquake and making sure you're not too hurt as things fall. But then comes arguably something much more powerful, which is the realization of what's happened, perhaps. And as you have to speak it to others, it's no longer something that stays within you. You have to recount, to others, my wife, my son, Natasha's grandparents, both sides, and friends and so forth. I mean, it's unbelievable. I think, our story of my story of loss is very much, well, I have a unique one perhaps, but because of living that moment. But it's a family story of obviously of loss, because Natasha was, of equal importance to her brother, to all other members of family, and of course, my wife, her mother as well, Tanya. And I think I dealt with it in a way that, because I had to go back to work, so this is not easy, because I owned and ran the company largely. Had a whole lot of staff that looking to me for what to do, and et cetera, et cetera. That was just terrible. Trying to put a face on while absolutely being, I would call it, mortally wounded, really. Because I really felt that Natasha, when she died, some of me died with her. Basically, it was very much, and I was so in grief. I remember breaking down constantly at work and just weeping in the toilets, as it were, hiding in the toilets. And I remember so many things, people sort of tippy-toeing around me all the time. But I don't think I realized the immense enormity of what I had seen, really, until a bit later on. Yes, something I'd seen, if you like, a powerful picture, effectively, in an art gallery in a very important moment. But I hadn't realized, what does that mean, if you see what I mean? And what does it really mean for me? I think it's the important bit. I could say, well, maybe that means for Natasha, angels have taken her to heaven, right? That's, you could say very simplistically, but what's the point of me seeing that? This might be happening all the time, but people don't see it. So why me? It was like in one way, a strange burden as well. And that burden had to be, if you like, if I say interpreted, to be made sense of, essentially, which was certainly not something that happened within a flash. It took quite some time, and it did happen through the first time for me going to church, essentially, the church where Natasha had been going, but the soft washing, as I call it, and learning about the Bible, the stories of the Bible. I began to actually listen week in, week, every Sunday, and begin to see actually how what had happened was really real. I was actually, in effect, like a character of sorts, if I put it this way, how I interpreted then, like in the play, God's play, his grand plan. And what happened to me had been happening to other people in different forms for a long, long time, and still does. It's just that I happened to be the one that was there, and it happened to me. It's strange that at the time it was very, very unusual. I wrote about it the following day. I wrote it all down, basically. And I emailed it to all my staff, basically, at the company. That's how that was just a compulsion to do that.
Gosh.
I have no idea what they made of it, I must say, because it was never discussed. I don't think people know how to talk about grief, let alone something arguably supernatural.
Yeah. You know, you said it then about how when Natasha died and all of the grief that goes with losing a child, which mortally wounded is probably the closest to language that you can get. But even then, you know, I can imagine that doesn't feel like it quite touches it either. So you've got that, but you, like you say, you also, a piece of yourself died, and you've been so articulate in saying, like, you believed that you could control things, and that's a safe belief, a comforting belief. And I'm struck by the idea that you lost that as well. You lost your whole belief system.
That's right.
Which
Absolutely.
is quite,
It also broke, I must say, it's like, you know, it broke me down, but from the inside, essentially, not on the outside, because still very, vaguely looked the same, but from the inside really broke me. I think you're quite right. It was all my things I believed in had built 50 years of my life on. It was literally vaporized, is how I put it. And that is a very different thing. And I didn't know who I was anymore, or what to be, how to be. So broken. The only thing that made sense to me was I should kill myself, basically, and commit suicide to go and find Natasha. Right.
Okay.
2 parents, basically 2 children. Tanya would stay with Alex. I will go and find her. Basically. Now that's all wonky, of course, isn't it? You know, we can look at it, but that was so powerful a force. I didn't realize I had such bad what's now called PTSD, which I got treatment for eventually, which was really helpful. But this is all part of such a crushing feeling that I didn't know where to go. I was kind of grabbing at any kind of quasi, not logic, but ideas going. And it's only actually discovering really the meaning of, well, coming to Christian faith, that journey. And it was really a meandering journey that actually saved me, because otherwise I would have already been gone.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that journey in a moment, but alongside the grief and the PTSD and all that was kind of going on, I assume would also be some significant feelings of anger, because obviously at the center of this was a sandwich that had not been properly labeled with the allergic ingredients that in fact were the cause of Natasha's death. So what was happening on that front? How were you coping with that and the questions that were being raised?
Yeah, I was very angry, very, very angry. And I was so angry that I would have fits of rage. I mean, real fits of, like enough to smash all the windows in the house, that sort of rage, basically. And I'd point that early days at God. How could you do this? I was furious. And I must say, being candid with you, used every possible expletive pointing at God.
Because in a way, he kind of, he sort of, you could say that through giving you that glimpse of a vision, he put himself in the firing line of your anger, because he'd shown you that he saw it. That
Very good point.
Yeah,
that's right. Perhaps by not doing that, actually, by nothing happening, if you will, I would have stayed on whatever my prior belief system, if you like, would be, and that would have led me or an outcome very different. But here, you're quite right. It gave me something to point to as a reason, a hook, effectively, and because otherwise, why show me that? What's this all about? You haven't explained anything to me. You've just done whoosh. And then my child is gone. What is that? And I was so incensed by it all. And coupled with the anger, also having discovered she died because of the allergic reaction to the food that she was allergic to, that none of us knew was in the sandwich, because it didn't include that ingredient on the ingredient labeling. This is a whole thing. It was like, what's wrong with our society? How can that be? We spent 15 years doing our best, and then to trip up and lose a child, in this way, because essentially what turned out to be a loophole in the food laws that very large companies were using out of convenience, really. And avoiding having to write the full ingredients on, which is something we totally relied on. Right. Transparency and effectively the truth of what's in your food. And by having omitted key ingredient she was allergic to, of which was full of that ingredient hidden in the dough of the bread, so not visible to the naked eye, we got really caught out. It was like a trap. It felt like we'd been trapped, like a bear trap. It's not right. And all this sort of sense of anger and kind of vengeance was boiling over in me, really. And it was so destructive, really destructive for my mother, my father, certainly for my wife and our son. I mean, when all they really needed was love, and care, here was the man, as I saw myself, of the family, actually going around with a sword and lashing at everything and everyone. That is terrible, really. It's so destructive.
So you find yourself out of control, essentially. You've lost control.
Yeah.
You were this person who knew what the script was. You were writing it for yourself, and here you are finding yourself angry, stricken with grief, life not making much sense anymore, completely understandably, but with this strange juxtaposition as well of the fact that something else happened in that moment that you haven't quite managed to get to the bottom of.
Yeah.
You mentioned already that you ended up in church. Could you sort of tell us what happened and how this all played into the story?
Well, it took us 5 days to work out how to bring Natasha's body back from France in a plane, in a special lead coffin, a transport coffin. It has to be very specific for bringing, people who have died back on a plane. We landed Friday night, and the following Sunday, so really 48 hours later, if that, 36 hours later, found myself in church, an evangelical church, not as in a very traditional church like some people might go to, one where there's more open teaching and things you learn. I would call it a bit like going to class. You come out having learned things, really, along with praise and everything else. And this was the church that Natasha had been going to for probably 2.5+ years for Friday youth group.
Wow.
And she'd been, not that I was even really aware of it, because as I think I alluded to earlier, I was so wrapped up and tied up with working and everything else. I really didn't pay much attention to things I wasn't interested in. And that was definitely the word church, something I wasn't interested in.
And it was something her friend, who had also been on the flight, was involved with.
Exactly. Yeah. So Natasha's friend, Bethany, her father, Adrian Holloway, so well-known, at the time, pastor of an evangelical church in London. And it's through that connection that Natasha had been going to the church, Everyday Church in Wimbledon, and for Friday sort of youth group, and then gone to New Day, something called New Day, which I'd never heard of either, and didn't pay any attention to either at the time. And it's that church that Tanya and I walked into on that Sunday morning, and I remember I was just like shell shocked. About 300 people kind of wrapped I would say their love and their care and their compassion around us, and certainly me, as it were. I was kind of overwhelmed by all these people I didn't know, all these faces, essentially, of all sorts, all the ethnicities, all the ages, essentially, a complete patchwork of society, effectively, wrapping themselves with love and care. And I think I don't know these people. What have I ever done for them? Transactionally. I was thinking, I haven't sold you something. You don't have to. It's not. It's not a swap. This was given to me effectively for free, in effect. And I remember sitting there, and week after week, coming to hear more of the Bible. So really, the New Testament. This was at that time. Things that I'd never picked up the Bible ever in my whole life. Just so you know, all those hotels I stayed in around the world, the Bible was often there in that era. That was the time when
the Gideon's Bible in the bedside table.
I said, Gideon, get out. Gideon, go into the cupboard in the drawer, and off he went. That was my relationship with Gideon and the Bible up until that point. And I remember just learning, and I'm somebody who learns. by listening, I'm not really I'm not somebody who's particularly academic, as in some people are great and read voraciously. Not me. But learning through hearing and questioning, so on. And it worked so well for me, I think, at the end of the day, that format. I wasn't thinking in that way, but I absorbed. And I began to realize that this has meaning. This old fart of a book that I had thought was some oldie worldy thing that talked about references, that was farming grain and seed. Now we have AI and everything else. What are you on about? Was my sort of view. But actually, strangely, it all started to make sense. And it didn't matter that it was about sheep, cows, that mustard seed grain. In fact, all of that made complete sense, essentially, to where I saw myself at that point. Another wounded person, another broken person, another, and it was like a jigsaw that week after week started to come together in pieces. And I could reflect on the image or the feeling I had, I suppose, about it. And it was very comforting, not just comforting because we sing. And so, comforting because it started to make sense. And I saw myself as part of the living Bible.
Can I ask you about, because I think it was going to this church that sort of gave you or challenged you to do something that I can imagine was so uncomfortable because of your anger. And it was to do with the CEO of Pret at the time. Can you just tell us that story? Because that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So again, I remember really distinctly was at church one day or Sunday and listening, and had this really strong vision, and that vision different than the one I said. This is not about yellow light and everything. Like this was like a piece of theatre playing out in front of me as I see you both right now.
Okay.
So it was full color, technicolor, if you like. And I remember seeing the boss of Pret a Manger, who I had completely blamed essentially for the death of my child, because I'd put it under his watch. This terrible thing had happened. And we'd discovered actually that they had hospitalized quite a lot of people and done nothing about it. And had they done something about it responsibly, then my daughter would be still alive. So I really put the sort of anger that way. And I had a lot of ill feeling, let's just say politely. But in this vision that came across as I was there listening to church was that we had a meeting with a number of the executives of the company and the big owners of the company. And at the end of the meeting, I remember going up to the man who I'd seen before, seen him in the inquest before. So I knew what he looked like, if you like. And going up to him at the end of the meeting and putting my hand on his shoulder and my other hand on his heart, and then saying, Clive, I just want you to know, I forgive you. I forgive you for the death of my child. And I say this because I know you are a father, as in a human father, a father of 2 children. And for you to be the best father, it's to your children. I want you to know that you are forgiven, basically. And this just passed by me as a scenario, a piece of theatre, essentially. And then I'm back in the room, if you know what I mean, but listening to, what the pastor was saying. So I didn't think much of it in the sense I didn't go, oh my gosh, what was that about? You don't have those sorts of sort of violent reactions. But then 3 days later, on the Wednesday, we had this meeting with the top execs, etc. And at the end of the meeting, there was the boss of Pret. It lasted about an hour and a half, the meeting. He's about to leave, etc. And I went up to him and I basically did exactly verbatim what I had seen in that vision, basically. And I told him, I forgive you for the death of my child. And all this because I remember learning a little bit about forgiveness obviously part of the preaching, but not just about forgiveness, because they touch on subjects, as you know, a bit and a bit and a bit here. You have to move around week by week. But I enacted that entirely, but not because I felt, I've got to do it. There was no sense of like, is it now? It just flowed in the most natural way without me even really thinking about it, actually. It was almost like I wasn't even doing it. I was bodily doing it, and I'd obviously imagined it or seen it happen in a few days before. And I just went through and did it. And I remember him being overwhelmed by it and his eyes balling up. And I remember just putting my hand on his heart and said, I forgive you. It's okay. And I know at that point, what happened to me after, in the days, the weeks, now the years, is it changed everything. That ability to, not only forgive him, I must say, but also forgive myself. It's very important. I blame myself that my own child died on my watch. What kind of man are you? You rubbish man, you useless person. What father are you? That's, it really is, blame yourself. And I had to also go through that forgiveness of myself, that I wasn't to blame myself for it. So I stopped beating myself up, if you like. And of course, I stopped pointing the finger at this person, Clive. And that changed really how I was able to feel, operate. And I remember it was like a release, a real release. I could suddenly speak in a different way. I could move in a different way. And I think I would characterize it, lots of good stuff started to happen in ways that were quite unbelievable, really. Maybe that's the subject of another moment.
Gosh. I mean, in an interesting way, as much as you say part of yourself died with Natasha, there's also, it feels in a funny way that she also gave you something.
Yeah.
Because the faith that had obviously been developing in her own life, which you'd sort of been almost unaware of, suddenly became true.
2 weeks before so I found out from Bethany afterwards that 2 weeks before Natasha died, Natasha had told Bethany, I want to get baptized. And of course, never made it. But we know, what Tanya was able to tell me afterwards, how actually Natasha did have quite a strong faith. It wasn't, just, I'm going to, for Friday mess around. Yeah. She'd been to New Day. She'd been really sort of, if you like, I say overwhelmed, kind of blanketed with that incredible, what we now all know is quite amazing event, and certainly for young people. And she had found a faith. She had found a Christian faith and believed in Jesus. I wasn't really aware of it then, because again, this is not something of interest to me all those years ago.
And I'm about to ask you a question that people will spend 1,000 lifetimes trying to work out and still not. So I'm not expecting an answer, but I would love just some thoughts you have in that you came to learn about a God who is kind and loving and caring and powerful and good through suffering and grief and loss and death.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, again, I'm not expecting a definitive, I've worked it out answer, but what have been some of your thoughts as you've wrestled with that? Because that's complicated, a complicated mystery, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then unfortunately, we've come to know around 50 families whose children have died in the UK since our own daughter died from food allergies. So and we meet most of them because we're called to do that from our heart. It's not the work of our charity, but it's just humans to humans. Yeah. And we travel the country to meet them and to sit with them and cry with them and hear their stories. And they are much like I was, incessant about how can this be, Now, some of those families are Muslim, some are Hindus, some are atheists, and sometimes they're Christians as well. They're a real mix, actually. But the pain is overbearing from them all. And I remember that well. I remember being in that moment, in their shoes. I think Tanya and I both do. But to answer your question, it is contradictory, you're right, on the face of it, that this loving, caring God who created us, cared that much to do it in the first place, right? Like a potter creates something. Well, if you didn't care, you wouldn't do it, right? Would you? You wouldn't make the pot.
Absolutely.
Or you wouldn't paint the painting if you're a painter, if you like. And yet, I sort of allows these, what we call horrendous things to happen, or at least feels horrendous to us in the time. It is contra, but the only reconciliation I have over it is through the teaching of the Bible, really. I wouldn't know it otherwise, I must say, is that it was never God's intention to be like that. And it's our brokenness, and the world we live in is so broken. The war, all the things that everyone listening will know about and have experience of, was never the intention. That was never what I would call, in my language, the grand design. It went a bit doolally, if you want to, in the early days. But God tried to fix it, again and again, give chances to people, to civilization, and it just hasn't clicked really yet. Anyway, and I don't profess to have any of the answers thankfully, my gosh, can you imagine how hot the phone line would be if it did? But I can say the broken world was never his intention. And if it was never his intention, then actually we shouldn't be pointing the finger at him. Then really we need to be pointing the finger at someone else. And I think we all kind of know who that is. It's the people, well, the devil, if you like, who's set out to break that beautiful, design that God had intended at, right from the beginning.
I mean, as you look at this from this very different perspective now, some years on, where does it leave you in terms of, I mean, it feels like there's a kind of a before and after version of Nadim, basically, from everything you've described. And the version, who you are today, as you say, things got evaporated, but something else grew in its place.
Yeah.
And what particularly, I suppose, I'm interested in this important theme of releasing control, not being able to predict or have the script written in advance. How do you think of that now? How do you sort of encounter and go through life if that way of the way you used to encounter it has changed so radically and fundamentally?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no perfect, bistable black and white, on-off state. There is always a tension, I think, of for me and maybe many others, wanting to seep some control back, if you see what I mean. Perhaps in my nature, our nature. Yeah. There's no doubt about it. And thankfully, my wife says, keep that in check. But that is true. But which is great.
Nadim,
I mean, the old Nadim, my gosh, is long gone, thankfully. But the trying to do things in your own strength sometimes does pop up. I mean, it really does, weekly. And you got to sort of, and I think the way to deal with that, is obviously asking, Jesus to come in and help me with it. Basically, that's simple. And I found what I think is amazing. So having no one to go to, the buck stops with me. I am the father, as in the human father to my family, and that's it. There's no more. To going to a point where there's the Father, Heavenly Father, where you can go to him for everything, pretty much everything. Your whole shopping basket, your weekly shop of problems, basically, if you want to. And you can swap some stuff out. You can hand things, and it's quite a very what's the word? Not just loving relationship, it's a very accepting relationship. It's two-way. It's not an old idea that you must keep sacrificing or cut bits off of you and hand them up until there's nothing left of you. Actually, the reality, it's so two-way that you really feel he wants you to flourish. And actually flourish is a really, something we don't really tend to think about much. And but flourish to, obviously, your belief in him, through Jesus.
It sounds like a very liberating way of engaging life, and it's interesting because that piece you mentioned about needing to forgive yourself, it feels to me like that act of grace in your life towards yourself and towards life itself is a way of saying, I'm here just to accept what happens and to know that I can't control it.
Yes,
but actually I'm here for something bigger than all of that.
I might try and answer it in a different way. I've discovered that actually trying to do things in your own strength can work. It does work. There are people who get part, but it doesn't last long, and it's not fulfilling. Second part, try to do it with God's help, or ask for God's help, essentially, assuming it's appropriate, obviously. And it actually happens. And when it happens so easily and so readily, you don't even realize it's happened, because your hand didn't have to really fight and hold a sword to do it. I found it absolutely remarkable. It's like having I could kind of call it like having a superpower in effect, but in a good way, obviously not in a bad way. And we've discovered through certainly the work, the people we've met, we meet the king, we meet all sorts of people all the time, regularly biggest, richest people in the world. People who I would normally be shaking a bit around, etc. It's so natural, and the asks and the things we talk to them about, and when they happen, you go, God, you've literally answered it again and then again, and it's amazing. And the benefit of that is makes you realize that actually you don't have to do anything really in your own strength at all. It's a real realization. You've got it this way, or you've got it that way.
It's almost the difference between letting go and holding on. And sometimes it's actually in the letting go that suddenly things flow.
Absolutely. And it is, so for a lot of people, including myself back then, counterintuitive.
Yes.
Letting go means losing control, but actually letting go, in this sense, you actually gain far more control in a different way.
Yeah.
And not only that, that leads to actually a much more happy state, less anxious, and all these other things that pile on by hanging on, actually. And it's so obvious to compare the two states, that certainly for my life, that I can feel and remember what it was like before, and the now, the way we're living our life now, and how unbelievable things happen all the time, and good things. Sorry, just to be clear about that. And you think, wow, how did that happen? You might say, and we just look at it. Well, we know, we know, and it's difficult to be more precise than that, really, because it is faith, really. It is faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want. We're running out of time, but I don't want to not mention some of the work that you've done since, in that we now have Natasha's Law, and I'd love you to break open exactly what that is. So what is in place now that wasn't in place when Natasha died. But there's also the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation. I had a look on it, and on it you say, the website says that no one is born with allergies. I had no idea, which then led me to think, why don't I know anything about allergies?
Yes.
Why don't so many of us know? And so I'd love if you could just break open the law, but also that some of the research, which, and it is wonderful to hear about how baked into that is this kind of this reliance not on yourself.
Well, we found that, I mean, going from a business world, essentially, before now purely into a charity world, it's very different. You know, business world is all about yourself, largely, and what you can do, and now this is all about what you can do for others, essentially. So it's very different. And that fits perfectly with faith, actually, to be honest, in a Christian faith. And we see Christian faith cut through and make things happen again and again. And with allergies, it's something new in the human world over. In the last probably 30 years, food allergies have started to come up more and more. And there's around 250 million people now with serious food allergies. About 4 million in the UK have allergies to soya, oats, wheat, egg, different nuts. In fact, what you would call common and old foods, you'd say, oh, I remember those in the biblical times. You might actually say, they're that old, these foods, and the ways of farming, dairy, etc. Now, as so many swathes of younger people and little children develop allergies, it's really hard, for them to live life around, as we mentioned before, the food economy. And Natasha's Law was born out of trying to fix, essentially, a hole in the law of this country, to stop people dying again in that way, against a backdrop of millions of people being food allergic. So it was really a question of Russian roulette, could happen again at any time in the same way. And so we campaigned hard across the road here, Parliament basically, and we pushed really hard for about a year and a half to change that law, essentially, pestering ministers, I remember Theresa May, the Prime Minister, and so on, writing many articles. And in the end, the good sense of it all, even though there was much lobbying against us by big business behind the scenes, the good sense of it, if you like, if I look at it that way, or I could call it the will of God, actually, and asking him to come and help us, it came through, and it passed through Parliament, Natasha's Law, in 2019, and was effective 2 years later everywhere in the UK. And affects, millions and millions of people in a good way. They can now much more safely eat out and live their lives around the food economy without the risk of death, basically, as happened to Natasha.
Extraordinary. Yeah. Extraordinary. There's so much more that could be said, but it's just been extraordinary to have you lay out so candidly and evocatively the story of what happened and the journey that you and the whole family have been on in the meantime. Is there any way you would point, I can imagine this raises all kinds of emotions for many people who have perhaps gone through situations of loss, who perhaps have children who experience, allergy, or there may be other conditions that they're struggling with. Any way you would point them, that any advice you would give to anyone who's in that situation, in terms of, having been through all of that, where you might point them if they're kind of going on their own journey of coping processing and seeing what the future holds.
Well, I think it's important to be honest, certainly from our experience. I think you never stop grieving. And there are, friends of ours who would say after a year, well, come on, shake yourself up. You should be over it by now. Really, sort of thing. But that's the reality of, the world, if you like. But, for people who've lost a child, no parent ever expects to bury their child. It's just not the natural order of things, at least not how we perceive it to be. Of course, the reality, it's been happening since, for thousands of years. I mean, many children died in childbirth, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we just sort of seem to block that largely from our minds, et cetera. And the pain of losing a child is so terrible. What I would say to anyone listening, going through what will happen next is much better to do that with God and with Jesus by your side and having essentially a relationship, however that is for those people, a faith, whatever that looks like, but through the Christian faith, it's so much more, you become much more able to walk that journey, which is inevitable, whether you have the faith or not, basically.
You're going to walk a journey.
You're going to walk a journey. You're going to basically have a life where people will look at you differently. They'll expect you to be different in some way, whether you like it or not. You'll feel strange often at all sorts of moments. You'll break down. You won't know how to be. But with Christian faith, as both Tanya and I, we have been able to walk that path, and not only walk that path, essentially help millions of other people. This is the extra bit here. We couldn't have been helpful and given so much compassion actually to other people, essentially, who've lost their children, and help them if we ourselves weren't more right by God and more understanding of that. We would be still so broken and unable to help others. We'd have probably dragged everyone down further into the mire if ever we had tried to attempt that. So with God, life is much better, a little bit easier, not made super simple and super easy. There'll still be lots of issues to go through, but the reality is they're all quite surmountable one way or another. Without God and losing a child, we often see families break up, divorce, all sorts of things happen, which become collateral damage for other members of the family, other children in a relationship. We've seen that. So for those listening, I say, be like me. If at all there's something to come out of this, I was the fool. I definitely was the fool. Absolutely can see that in myself. I'm no longer that fool. I'm definitely a better human being. I've definitely got a relationship with Jesus, with God. It's great. It really is, you can feel alive with it. And he comes in and helps you when you ask at those really difficult moments. And that's all you could ever really ask for.
Well, can't think of a better way to end the show than that.
Absolutely. Nadim, thank you so much for being so generous with your story, because I know it can never be an easy thing to talk about. So we are incredibly grateful. We will put links to the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, which has so much helpful information on the website. We will put that in the show notes. We are incredibly thankful that this conversation was able to happen, and it was only able to happen because of your generosity. So if you want to make further conversations like this happen, then as usual, seenandunseen.com/give is where you can make that happen. But for now, we will see you next time.